Macon. I am the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor for Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties. So I have two sets of big shoes to fill. I'm the new Glenn Nader and the new Roger Ingram, which are both very big shoes to fill. Just to give me some sense of who's here, how many folks are livestock producers in the crowd? Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of ranching and the kind of climate that we're dealing with here now. And I want to start by walking us all back to the years that Matthew talked about, 2014 and 2015, or 2013 through 2015. In October of 2013, I went to work as a lambing manager for a large sheep outfit in Rio Vista. And if you think back to the weather that fall, we had a little bit of germination, we had a rain right after Thanksgiving, and then it got really cold, and then we had nothing for 60 days. In fact, I was recalling driving up this morning that every time I've come to a drought workshop at SF Rec, it's rained. So next time we have dry conditions, just call and we'll get that organized. But thinking back to 2013, we started lambing in mid-October. By the 1st of January, we had fed a year's worth of alfalfa to those ewes. We had absolutely no forage. We started with 1,300 ewes, and by March, when we went through everything that had not done well at lambing, we were down to 900 ewes, and I was out of a job. So the drought had some really significant impacts. Because of that, I ended up working here as a herdsman for a year. 2013, 2014, I believe, is when Animal Science destocked pretty significantly here, cut cow numbers by about a half, roughly in that neighborhood. In the winter of 2014-15, we grazed all of the road system on Forbes Hill where we just were, because that's where we had grass in that really critical time period. So it had some really practical implications in terms of livestock production. I really liked Andy's infographic about the difference between climate and weather. I'm kind of a science fiction geek too, and there's another great quote from the guy that wrote Dune that says, climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. And I think that's helpful for thinking about this as well. But when we think about what's going to happen in our part of California, we are likely going to deal with warmer temperatures. We don't know what's going to happen with precipitation. We've seen incredible swings in variability just in the last 4 or 5 years in precip in this part of the state. The extremes seem to be getting more extreme. The dry periods are drier and warmer, and yet we have these really intense wet periods as well, which I think creates some challenges. So how does variability affect ranch management? How long was the spring flush this year in the foothills? The time from when the grass was grazable to when cows didn't want it.
30 days?
I think it was less. I think it was about 7 days. It was probably longer than that, but it wasn't very long this year. And that's because we went from fairly cool conditions, cool soil temperatures, I suspect, to all of a sudden north wind and really warm. And so how do we stock our ranches in those cases? Wildfire is an issue, both in terms of the direct impacts, but burning up fall and winter feed can be a huge issue for folks. We've got, sometimes a lack of fall forage. Conversely, sometimes we have more fall forage than we know what to do with. We had an issue in our sheep operation 3 years ago where we pulled more lambs because we had more green feed in November and December than we typically see. And so there's all these consequences from that variability that we have to cope with. If you look on page 4 and 5 in this handout, and Matthew and others have talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to just show you some of the challenges that we've dealt with in the last 12 years. 2006 and 7, at my place in Auburn was the driest year we've recorded since we've lived there. Less than 20 inches of rain. And yet we were about average in terms of forage production here at SF Rec. So it was a timing issue, I suspect. 2010 and 2011, pretty good year forage-wise, and a lot of rain. We were at almost 50 inches of rain in Auburn that year. And so how do you make an adjustment from 2006 and 7 in terms of your ranch management to a wet year like 2010? 2013 and 2014 was a record drought. We actually had a little bit more rain, but if you look at that graph on page 5, we had virtually nothing until January, as we recollected a minute ago. And if you look at those bar graphs on the forage, really until April we didn't have much here. And those of us that are still paying off the feed we purchased those years remember that distinctly. 2016 and 2017, we got 5 frickin' feet of rain in Auburn. I couldn't wait. I swore to my kids I'd never complain about rain again after the drought, but I sure griped about the mud that year. And then if we look at last year, flip that page, in Auburn it was a pretty average rainfall year, about 32 inches of rain. 5,000 pounds of forage here at Sierra. That's a lot of grass. And I think it's really interesting to kind of think about those longer term impacts on forage production and those types of things. So if we look at just those 5 years in the last 12, how do we figure out how to stock our ranches, right? How do we do that? It's a real big challenge from an economic standpoint. Even, I think one of the challenges for us, and I appreciate Matthew's talk, and I think one of the real issues for us is how we incorporate this new variability and extremes in those predictive models. I think that's going to be a real challenge for us. Case in point, the last 2 years have been good forage years, but there were stretches of December and January in each of the last 2 forage production years where I got out my drought plan and started looking at it. We had less than an inch of rain in December of 2017. It ended up being the wettest year we've ever had. And so trying to figure out what kind of decision scales we need to be working on can be really challenging. One of the things that I've really focused some of my work on is looking at how ranchers are dealing with drought. And Matthew had the table from a paper that we'd done several years ago. We've subsequently done some follow-up interviews with livestock producers all over the state, and rather than just focusing on cattle producers, we've looked at all rangeland livestock. So we've talked to cattle, sheep, and goat producers in 2016. Of those operations, most were cattle. We did have a number of multi-species operations as well. And we asked about what their preparation strategies, what their response strategies were, and then what they were doing to recover from drought. And just very briefly, no huge surprises here, but if you look on page 8, kind of the drought impacts in terms of the percentage of ranchers that experience them in our survey, and then the severity of the impact. Obviously, reduction in forage availability was the biggest impact. But for cattle producers, one of the biggest issues was a reduction in stock water. They may have had feed, but if they didn't have water in those pastures to get to them, they couldn't utilize the feed. Conversely, what we also found is that the sheep and goat guys were able to haul water because that's what they do. And so the impacts were different for them than they were for cattle producers. Increased expenses were also a significant impact. One of the unique things economically in that last drought was, at least going into it, the cattle market was at record highs. And so people that had to sell cows actually had to find a way to protect their capital gains in that scenario rather than deal with lost revenue, which was I probably made recovery from that drought a little different than past droughts have been. If we think about kind of proactive or preparation strategies, those of you who are ranchers, how many of you have a drought plan, even if it's just in your head? Good. And that's fairly typical in terms of what folks are doing. But a lot of people incorporated pasture rest. Many people felt like using a conservative stocking rate was probably their most effective tool. And that's certainly what we've done in our sheep operation. Certainly how SF Rec has moved into stocking this place, I think, to have that buffer. What happened to all the fall feed northeast of Chico last year? So So we've got this other trade-off that we're having to deal with now, right? We've got this idea that if we set a conservative stocking rate, that's our fall buffer. But we're also having to deal increasingly with fire threat, and that's part of that ranching in a variable climate that I think we're trying to figure out how to cope with. In terms of response strategies, what I thought was really interesting, because I came here and heard Glenn Nader and Roger Ingram both say, don't feed your way out of drought. 82% of the folks we interviewed fed their way out of drought. Why would somebody choose to do that? Why would you buy feed?
Well, I think we keep thinking it'll go away, or we love our cows, or I mean a million reasons. You want everything to stay the same, and it isn't going to stay the same.
That's an excellent point. The cows that run here know this place, right? Yeah. I'm not going to go to Galt and buy cows to replace them when the drought is over and have them know that this place right away. Same with my sheep.
Nor will it be the same quality of cow.
Exactly. So we want to think about maintaining our genetic potential, right? Lots of people did reduce their stock numbers or rent additional pasture. But if you look at that last slide on page 9 there, a lot of people started looking at early weaning as a strategy. Why early weaning? Why would you want to wean calves early in a drought?
Save the feed.
Save the feed, right. So you're saving it two ways, right? That lactating cow is consuming a third to a half more forage than she would if she were dry. And a 400-pound calf is eating a considerable amount of grass too, right? And so one of the things that early weaning does, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is it frees up some other opportunities. When do those of you that do have cattle here, how many are fall calvers? And fall is a loose definition, right? We say fall's August to December. So if you're fall calving and in California our rainy season is in the wintertime, maybe early weaning would be an option for you, as opposed to a spring calving operation in other parts of the country. But if you look at early weaning, those that were cattle-only producers, 2/3 of them weaned early as a drought response strategy and felt it was pretty effective. Fewer of the sheep folks weaned early, but they felt it was very effective. And overall, nearly 60% of the producers we talked to weaned their offspring early in that as a response to that drought. But what we realized in thinking about this further, and actually we tried a demonstration, kind of a case study of that here at SF Rec in 2015.
15, yes.
Just because we were short of feed. And then that project has morphed into this project that we're working on now. So like anything else, there's trade-offs with early weaning. It is a way to maintain your proven genetics, to keep your cow herd intact without having to sell those females that know the ranch. But those lighter sale weights are going to mean less revenue, right? That's even a sheep guy can figure that part of it out. On the other hand, if you've lowered your stocking rate by getting those calves or lambs off the ewe or off the cow and off the ranch, maybe you're not having to buy all that extra feed. So maybe there are some cost savings. The other thing that I think we haven't really looked at in a fall calving system on annual rangelands is how that fits with the rest of your production calendar. What are the logistics of doing that? Is it worth bringing those cows in January when you wouldn't be working them anyway to think about early weaning? Or does it need to fit when they come into pred check? How do we make that fit in terms of those production systems? And then Matthew talked about this idea of trigger dates or key dates, and I think that's a really important consideration too. And I'm encouraged that there may be some prediction tools that help us make better informed decisions about that. There's been no research on this in annual rangeland systems. Jeremy did an extensive literature review, and it's really been focused on perennial systems on the high plains or in the Rocky Mountains. Not really looking at what we can make work here. So we were fortunate to get some funding from Western SARE to look at this over the course of 2 years. The weather's cooperating. We've had no drought since we started the project, but we are able to maybe glean some information out of doing this. And I want to really emphasize that we're trying to make this as participatory as possible. We have a producer steering committee that's really helped us walk through some of those key production questions and timing issues to make it more applicable on the ground. So we want to try to figure out three things. We want to quantify the influence of early weaning on cow and calf performance, on pasture utilization, soil protection, and on biodiversity in our rangeland systems. We want to create a decision tool that will help a producer evaluate those trade-offs because it's not, I suspect, now that I'm over 50, nothing is black and white to me anymore. But I suspect there are trade-offs in this. And then help people deal with this on their own specific operations. So why are we right here? You're looking at a hillside that's part of one of our treatment pastures. We've taken 84 of the UC Davis Animal Science Department cows and randomly assigned them to a traditional weaning or early weaning group. And then we put them on pastures that are roughly 100 acres based on whether they're an early weaning or a traditional weaning cow. And we're trying to put them out there at similar stocking rates. They'll be out there from the time that the early weaned calves are weaned in March until they are supposed to start to calve in early September. And we're going to look at a couple of different parameters over the course of 2 grazing seasons. With the cows, we're looking at body condition score. So we want to know what that does, pulling that calf off early. Again, even a sheep guy can figure out if you're on the spring flush of grass and you're not nursing a calf, you're probably going to increase body condition, but we'll have some numbers to put to that. We're going to look at weaning weights on both the traditional and the early weaning calves. And then on the rangeland level, we'll look at forage production and utilization, forage quality, species composition, and those parameters as well. But we're also tying in the economics. And as the discussion at the last stop suggested, economics is kind of the overlay of all of this for a rancher. You've got to know what it's going to mean to does it make more sense to buy feed? And hopefully we can put some numbers to this as well. We also need to value that retention of genetic potential. There is a value to keeping those cows that know a particular landscape. Our steering committee was really helpful in saying, make early weaning fit when you'd be doing something else. And so animal science was preg checking cattle March 19th, as I recall. And that seemed like a time when we had all the cattle in the corrals that it would make sense to go ahead and wean the early weaned calves. They also suggested that there are some trigger conditions beyond just weather that we ought to look at if we're doing this study. What's the cash market doing? What's the futures market doing for feeder cattle? What's the feed market? What's corn doing in terms of cash and futures markets? If the cow market's really good, maybe that's the time you get rid of your older cows, right? Don't worry about weaning the calves early. The other risk management strategies that you might have. All of those things our steering committee suggested ought to go into this consideration. So this is our first year. If you really want to come out and help, I know that Marissa'd love to have all kinds of extra help on May 30th. We'll be doing the traditional weaning with the calves. Then we'll be collecting body condition scores. I'll be clipping, just counted it up, 90 forage plots next week, 2 weeks from now. So if you want to come out and learn how to clip forage, let me know that too. We will value the calves that we weaned in March as if they were sold on March 19th, the day that they were pulled off the calves. And then we'll start looking at the differences in forage production between the early weaning and traditional wean pastures, trying to put a value on that forage. And I think I wish we were doing this more years. I think it'll be interesting to see if there's any reproductive changes in those early wean versus traditional wean. I suspect in a year like this where we've got plenty of forage, we're not going to see any of that. But certainly in a drought year, that's a way to keep body condition score coming back. And this is, for you ranchers, this is old hat, but maybe for others here, to get a cow bred every year, we've got about 80, 85 days from the time she has her calf to the time she has to conceive next year's calf to get her back in condition nutritionally to conceive a calf. And in a drought year, that can be a pretty challenging task. So I'm not hoping for drought, but it would be nice to be able to measure some of those responses too. So with that, I have a question for you all, unless you have questions for me, and I'll save my question for last. Any questions? Yeah, Matthew.
You had a bullet point back on page 10 about the method of weaning onto trucks versus fence line weaning and backgrounding, and I didn't know if you had any further thoughts about if that was made a difference and maybe even economically too.
Yeah, so great question. And just to explain, if you're not familiar with those terms, there are several different management techniques for weaning calves or lambs or whatever. One is to fence line wean, where they can still smell and see and hear mom, but they can't nurse. And that seems to reduce stress on those calves or those lambs in the weaning process. One of the reasons we want to reduce stress is to keep those animals gaining, right? Not have that setback when they're all of a sudden away from mom. Versus putting them right on the truck, letting somebody else deal with it. In terms of the best management practices and sending calves to another place, if the ball, what we call the ball, is out of them, if they're not calling for mom anymore, even a 30 to 45 day weaning period is better, so that we're taking care of any disease or sickness issues at that time frame. There is more value in those calves. I suspect if we had a fall or a winter like we had in 2013, 2014, most folks would decide to put the calves on the truck and get them gone, just because they're weaning because they're out of feed. They're not weaning for economic reasons. But we do need to look at that if there's any differential between that those longer weaned calves versus going right on the truck. Tina Saitone has done some work at Davis looking at some of those programs in terms of calf values on the video market. And I think it'll be helpful to look at some of that data as well. Good question. It's always good to be the guy before lunch. Everybody wants to get back and eat.
Yeah, what was the average age of those early weaned calves, roughly? What, about 6 months?
About
But they averaged almost 400 pounds.
399 pounds on the steers and then 368 pounds on the
Good question. Yes.
As far as how would early weaning improve reproduction if the cow already needed to be bred before?
So it'd be the subsequent year, right? So she's when we're early weaning under this scenario, she's already bred with her next calf, hopefully. But it may influence the next year because we're not drawing her down to nurse a calf, carry a calf in dry conditions. We're letting her body condition score come up before she's calved. So that's why a 2-year study is not really going to get us that information. Any thoughts on that, John, that you would add?
No, I don't think so. I think it's kind of wait.
Yeah. Yep. Yes.
Why do they only give you the 2 years?
Because
Is it just an issue of funding or
Yep.
finding somebody to support it?
yep.
So you could get funding down the road to extend it.
And if I could convince animal science that we ought to keep doing this, absolutely. You know, it's
Because
hard.
it seems more valuable to have the data go a little longer so that you can really get a picture.
Absolutely.
Because you could have an anomaly with the 2 years that you pick.
Well, and I think in terms of reproductive success, I fully expect that the feed conditions were such this year that we're not going to see any difference, if I were predicting. I think that's one of the challenges in doing drought research on annual rangeland with livestock. You've got to be opportunistic to find that year that you can do the research, and then how do you replicate that? So it's a challenge. If there's no more questions from me, I have a question for you all. Thinking about this from a drought from a livestock producer standpoint, what are the questions we should be asking? I mean, this center exists so that we can ask those questions with somebody else's cows, right? So,
I'll be willing to use my my own cows, but I think that, you know, I learned that you should prepare for the drought by adjusting your stocking so you have feed on the ground to get you through the drought. And you know that works here, except in a year like this where you have no rain till the end of November and it pours, and I had the biomass to get me through, but the feed quality wasn't there, and you know I'm looking for something that I can stockpile to have feed quality in December and January that can complete that cycle, so I can get feed coming into the spring.
You know, I think our seed guys here have some things that actually they're trying some of this on the field station here for some of that winter, the summer dormant, fall and winter active forage that I think.
You know,
But then you come to the economics, right?
yeah, I've got some of that in, but you know, I don't know. You know what I need to know is if that feed quality will remain in that feed into the winter.
One of the other pieces of that question that came out in our results that I think we can do some more analysis of. I think the people that said we bought feed were not buying replacement feed for the most part. They were buying protein that allowed them to utilize the dry feed that they'd been able to save. And so I think an area where we can do some more examination is what are the most cost-effective and production-effective tools for getting supplemental protein into animals where we've saved dry feed. And I think that could be a question that we answer collectively too.
Have you looked at bale grazing?
That what?
Bale grazing?
That we haven't looked at it here, I don't think, but that would be something to look at potentially too.
Yeah, and how that would work.
Yep.
Here, you know, we don't have round bales here, so.
Yep. So there's all this infrastructure question to that as well, right? I think if we're done with questions, is it lunchtime?
Yeah, thank you. Let's give Dan a hand.